Leanna, Hieber. Welcome to the archive today. November, we spoke about steampunk and talking about the fictional writing of the Victorian era. And I feel like today is perfectly suiting because not only am I sitting in a blizzard, but I am also under the weather, which I think the Victorian era is kind of infamous for is its disease and disease outbreaks.
Yes, true. There's a lot of them. There's a whole lot of them throughout the course of the 19th century. Yeah, a lot of palliative care, not a whole lot of actually going to the source to root out the problem because, well, for all of the advances in the Industrial Revolution that came through in the 19th century, medicine was lagging a bit behind. So I offer you some laudanum for your cold symptoms today.
Why, thank you. That is, I'm pretty sure the right sort of treatment. Um, I think we had I had Rene Fluery on, and we were talking about how
Absolutely. Love her.
arsenic was medicinal at times.
Yeah. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. They had no sense of what the actual lethal dosage was. It was arsenic was in bindings of books. It was used for green coloration. We famously know the arsenic dress that killed people wearing it because there was levels of arsenic in the clothing. There would have been used specifically was used for green coloring in all kinds of different things, wallpapers too, things like that. So just stuff that lethal toxins that there just was not a sense of what was too much. And so yeah, toxicology was not invented in the 19th century, which is why you had a lot of Victorian widows whose husbands died under mysterious circumstances. So
Perfect. Ideal.
I do.
Um,
Well, for many of those widows who had no other recourse because you weren't really allowed to divorce people, if you were in a situation where your spouse was abusive, that was very often the way out.
yeah. I think I can't remember who said it, but Victorian era divorce was just about impossible.
It was really, really difficult. It wasn't, and also just property law for women at the time. It really wasn't until the 1850s and the 1860s. So you're well into the latter half of the 19th century before there starts to become any property laws at all for women to be allowed to have their own property, let alone laws against abuse. Women and children did not have laws protecting them from abuse until it was actually Henry Bergh who created the American Society for Prevention for Cruelty to Animals. And when he founded the ASPCA, he was noticing that there was a link between um, violence that would happen to horses in New York and wanting to link that to violence in domestic situations. And so he was able to kind of create a study of sort of percentages and say this is all correlated and led to some of the first both animal cruelty prevention laws that also were working to curb domestic violence too. So it's like, it's interesting for me. That's why I love writing about the 19th century, because you start to, in that time period, the culture and society and the literary minds and the scientists and the philosophers and everyone was kind of starting to interconnect certain things that now I think we take for granted as being interconnected, that they were kind of putting together for the first time and also trying to lay a groundwork on that was then backed up by data and backed up by science and backed up by correlation that had, you know, sort of the causality was being addressed across a wide range of societal ills, and thusly we see the finally the ending of slavery, both in England and in America. Finally, because in a lot of ways it wasn't just the Civil War. There was also one of the things I find really interesting is that Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park, before he designed Central Park, Olmsted went around the country under the pen name of Yeoman and wrote for the New York Times about the economic disadvantages of slavery. and wrote about how this is not only inhumane but also economically unsustainable, as a way to pressure moneyed people in New York to try to stop investing in cotton, to try to stop investing in the economics of of the inhumane and cruel practices that were just still being kind of taken as well. This is just how society is. Well, no, by the 19th century they're saying no, actually we can and will dream up a better world for everybody. And so I think that's for me the latter half of the 19th century where we get what would become our groundwork for modern civil rights is all being laid in the late 19th century. Feminist treatises were being written in the late 1700s. Mary Wollstonecraft, Vindication of the Rights of Women, that's something from the 1700s. So, talking about things like suffrage and women's rights, all of this was very, very, very much on the minds of people in the 19th century. That's not a 20th century invention. Yes, the fight for women's suffrage would not finally become law until the 20th century, but the fight was happening and ardently in the 19th century. So that's why I write in the late 19th century, because so much of what we think of and take for granted in the modern era was coming into focus and view and implementation by the end of the 19th century. So whether it's from plumbing to electricity to the modern telegraph leading to what would become the telephone, there were huge telephone operating centers in 1892 in Manhattan. And so some of my characters are working class women who are, working in some of the industries that were coming through in these emergent industries as well. So that's why I write in the sort of historical fantasy vein. I'm specifically writing what's known as gas lamp fantasy. So that's a delineation from steampunk. So if you think about steampunk as Victorian science fiction or Victorian set 19th century-esque steam powered era, that's why we get the word steampunk. So steam powered era science fiction. I'm writing gas lamp fantasy, which is the gaslit era of it's leading into what will become the electrical era. But the gas lamp fantasy allows for that sense of what the atmosphere is. It's still gaslight, it's still candlelight, it's got a gothic feel to it. And you're using fantastical means and fantasy tropes for your characters to solve problems. So rather than turning to technology in my stories that are historical fantasy, I'm turning to things like magic and prophecy and psychic resources and ghosts and ghost lore as how my characters solve their problems in my worlds. So
Yeah. And actually, in perfect timing, this is also the period of the spiritualism movement.
yes.
We, we've had a couple of very exciting videos already, one covering just kind of the general um, with regular on the show, Philip Carici.
Great.
And then not that long ago, the Portsmouth Athenaeum's archivist, Katie Sternberger, um, dug up an amazing piece that also involved a Boston newspaper devoted to spiritualism, just to give this sense as to how big it was at that time.
It
Uh,
was. Yeah, there was so many spiritualist publications. And so 1849 is considered like the birth of spiritualism. And then because at that time the Fox sisters that was their first public demonstration of the rapping on tables to communicate with the spirit world. But the Fox sisters were like, yeah, they were sort of a kickoff point, but they were one of many, as I'm sure that you've covered, is that this was already in the idea of communicating with the spirit world was not new to the Fox sisters rapping on tables. It was just that was a new way of like putting on almost a show about it, which would be that's the crux of the spiritualism conflict. That's at the heart of spiritualism, is because so much of it was fraudulent. But not all psychic phenomena is fraudulent. There's plenty of things that are like, I mean, I go into all things with an open mind, but a skeptic's mind first. And then I've had enough inexplicable things. And I've had encounters with legitimate psychics who I'm like, there's no way you could have known that. that I am absolutely a believer, but I'm a skeptic first because of the fact that so much of the 19th century was full of frauds and people just trying to take advantage of people and people using spiritualism like they were magicians. So they knew how to do magic tricks to make things seem like there was a communication happening when it was just an elaborate magic trick. And that's the kind of stuff that people like Harry Houdini wanted to put a stop to and just expose because you're like, that's not spiritualism, that's just magic tricks. So I love putting that question of is it a real psychic phenomenon or is it fraudulent into my work because a lot of my characters are spiritualists. They are working in an environment where they know there's fraud and they are working with legitimate psychic gifts in a society that is either going to brand them all as foolish or is just going to discount them because they're women anyway. But they're using the paranormal, they're using spiritualism as a means to an end, which is what women did at the time. There's plenty of women who had no psychic gifts whatsoever, but they used spiritualism as a platform to, like you're saying, with that Boston paper, to write, to be professional writers, to have their worldviews as given to them by the spirit world. Well, for a lot of them, they were just trying to write what was often very progressive thoughts down in these newspapers because spiritualism had newspapers all around all around the globe in different ways. And obviously, in different parts of the world, you were going to have different cultural things that was going to be in play. But a lot of 19th century spiritual thought was borrowing a lot of Eastern philosophy, too. When you think about the Theosophical Society, which was founded by Madame Blavatsky, she was a Ukrainian Russian Ukrainian emigre to the United States and set up the Theological Society's offices in Manhattan. I'm a New York City ghost tour guide too, so the ghost lore and the mystical occult lore of New York is also really fascinating to me. And in the
Oh,
Theosophical Society, it's so great. It's such a great time period. So yeah, she's pulling from a lot of Eastern thought, and she's pulling that into her the Theosophists were really kind of trying to open up the idea of mysticism and be like anybody can be a high priestess, which was appealing to a lot of people at the time. It was a lot of it was very appropriative of things in Eastern thought. That was definitely also something that was happening in the 19th century. So it's such a rich time, not only for science and for advances in technology, but then you have all of these different sects and occult interests that are coming into play and then spiritualism just becomes this obsession. The idea of having parlor seances is just like the new hot thing. So that is threaded through every single one of my pieces.
very interesting to put it that way. It's like you're not a cool kid if you're not going to the parlor seance this week.
I mean, it was, you got to think about like there weren't going to the movies at the time. There weren't, you couldn't reading was an increasingly available entertainment for people because the Industrial Revolution and the emergent middle class allowed for the average person to start to be able to maybe have a few pennies left over to be able to buy a penny dreadful, one of the little lurid little stories. And you start to have genre fiction really have this enormous explosion in the 19th century because you have people that are starting to have a sense of, okay, there's work and then there's maybe a little bit of time for entertainment. So they're either going to the local theater where there's adaptations of any number of vampire stories or whatnot, or some other, melodrama that's popular at the time. But then the parlor seance allows you to be close to people, maybe strangers, and the idea of taking off your gloves and holding hands with somebody that you don't know. There was also a way of like starting to kind of play with social norms in a way that spiritualism kind of broke down some barriers that way too. So that's also very fun to play with.
Yeah, there was a lot of social norms, some of which we're just definitely not going to be able to get into detail about. Um, but during this time period, um, there's this remarkable. Not only is there a remarkable resemblance of the spiritual stuff going on nowadays, during this time period, uh, we have this amazing fantasy looking back on it, or romantic perspective because people are dressed so nicely. They look so beautiful. The art is just remarkable. I love going to here in Maine to the Brickstore Museum.
I love them so much.
They really are great. And I love the summer events when they open up the garage doors and they show the old carriages with the signs, the
Yeah.
business signs. It's wonderful to look at. Uh,
Yeah, I can't I cannot recommend that museum enough. I'm part of their steampunk festival, and I have been for like the past 10 years, and I just love them. Cynthia, the director there, and everyone who works there is so delightful, and they're a huge resource. My upcoming nonfiction called America's Most Gothic Haunted History Stranger Than Fiction, that has a whole chapter about Southern Maine and ghost ships, and the Brickstore Museum specifically was very, very helpful in resources there. So anyway,
yeah,
big huge love to the Brickstore Museum. And I love that they have a lot of practical things from the time period.
yeah. And I take it since you probably are a regular for the Kenny Monk, you've also gone to the Victorian mansion in Portland. Um, it's amazing also too to look at what was considered a mansion at that time, and
Right.
now there's like some normal houses that
Right, right,
big
right.
mansions that are bigger than it. So I'm curious why does steampunk captivate the minds of people?
That's a great question. And I think um part of it is because we want to romanticize the 19th century. You're right, exactly, in that the clothing was so lavish and beautiful, and the the arts and crafts movement and the Art Nouveau works of that, there was such artistry. And when you start to see in the 19th century an interest in things like interior design, Louis Comfort Tiffany, who became famous for stained glass lamps, had started in like ecclesiastical and church stained glass, and then founded an interior design company. Actually, founded it with a woman, Candace Wheeler, who's considered the mother of interior design, and the arts and crafts movement and the desire for beautiful things in the home is part of the reason why we have this romanticism of the 19th century, because people were thinking about, oh, maybe I can have works of art in my home, not just in the museums or not just in sacred spaces. What if we made our home our castle? And that started to become an increasingly appealing thing for, again, we have class dynamics are very, so you have an interest in more working class people being able to either make because they're taking classes at some art institute to be able to make something beautiful for their home, or they're able to invest in something small that can be put into their houses. And like the woodworking, thinking about things like you're just saying about the Victorian mansion in Portland versus the McMansions. Like, sure, there might be a modern mansion that's enormous, but is it going to have that beautiful woodwork? Is it going to have a beautiful stamped tile fireplace? Is it going to have a tin stamped ceiling? Is it going to have a balustrade carved with beautiful motifs? That's the thing about that I think why people love steampunk too, is it allows for that detail. Steampunk and Gaslamp Fantasy want to set the scene. They want to create an environment that is immersive for you. But then there's also a reimagining, because that time was full of strife and that time was full of difficulties. If you were not a rich white man in the 19th century, you had a much harder time of it than anybody else. So the the ability for some of those fluid class dynamics allows for us in our modern era to look at some of those parallels to the struggles that we're having today. When we think about the robber barons of the 19th century, that's not very different than what things like private equity are doing in taking a company and just selling it and stripping it for parts. When we think about the concept of robber barons who were monopolizing industries, that's not really different than a lot of what corporate takeovers have been happening, or hedge fund various other Wall Street tricks that are happening now that were very destabilizing in the 19th century. And so we have a lot of economic parallels to the 19th century. And I think that is why people are drawn into steampunk, because you can parallel a lot of what's happening in the late, especially the Gilded Age dynamics and the Gilded Age financial situations are very much what we're in now. So there's a way to sort of talk about what's happening now, but not talk about what's happening now. Steampunk and gaslight fantasy allows us to create parallels, but reimagine things, include people that were left out of the historical narrative. That for me is very important. Including, people of color into the historic narrative, which they were a part of, but were very often erased out of. And we see a push towards this in a certain amount of, there's revisionist history that's happening and taking women and peoples of color accomplishments out of federal monuments or out of their actual place in history, that people have been to put them back into those places that they always were. This is not revisionist. It's not revisionist history to put people into the narrative that they were already in. But in the 19th century, there was a very much the patriarchy was very much in play, and they were making the rules about who could and couldn't be part of the narrative. And women made a lot of strides in the 19th century as to being included, but you've got different marginalizations that are also still trying to kind of have their voice heard. That's why steampunk and gaslight fantasy can be so powerful, because it will shift the lens and say, okay, well, what was happening for the people, the below stairs staff at a given mansion? What was happening for people who were marginalized, who might have come from immigrant families coming from all around the world, escaping troubles, be it the Irish potato famine or escaping pogroms that were happening in from the 1700s on in hundreds of periods of time of unrest. And in the 19th century, especially if you're an American, there's so many different people coming from all over the world into this country and really starting to create the exciting, diverse fabric of this country. But also you have the conflict of that time, that it's also at a conflict of native lands being appropriated and stolen, and all of the violence is there. American history is very, very complicated. And so a lot of steampunk narratives will take place in Europe, but Europe also was having its own upheavals at that point too. When you start to think about the 19th century in Europe, you've got the Franco-Prussian War that's happening. You've got a lot of different emergent difficulties that would be some of the tensions that would lead up to the First World War. All of that stuff was in play in the Victorian era. Queen Victoria and all of her grandchildren, there was a lot of strife there. There's a lot of drama there. So it's a dynamic time period to be writing about, but it's also one that is, you do have to do your research and you have to know your rules before you break them, because otherwise then you're just writing fantasy and you're not actually writing historical fantasy if you don't pin some things to actual historic events. So there's got to be a clear timeline of like where, all right, so here I've set a realistic 19th century New York City where Teddy Roosevelt is the police commissioner of New York City, which is true. And then here's a secret precinct that is run by ghosts inside the NYPD. So that's where my fantasy starts. But it's in a constraint of, okay, this really was happening in Teddy Roosevelt's police reform in New York City. And then there was this little carved out department that I just sort of create a secret history about. So sort of, Victorian X-Files is kind of a lot of how I sort of pitch and view my work.
Well, that definitely sounds like some exciting material to read.
Thanks. I hope so. I have fun with it. It's a calling. It has been since I was a kid.
Good. I think fun is probably the most important thing when being a writer. I can vouch on my own end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It comes back. I mean, the business is tough. It's tough, as you know, to be a creator. And publishing and content creation has changed so much in the past. I mean, my debut novel, Strange and Beautiful, came out in 2009, and so much has changed. And I'm traditionally published. And that my first publisher is no longer existent. It was They did a lot of mass market paperbacks, like the small, these little mass market paperbacks, which just even these small books, this has kind of gone out of fashion in bookstores aren't carrying these small ones as much anymore. There used to be Borders used to have like spinning racks of them. Barnes and Noble used to have spinning racks of them. Walden Books had them everywhere, back in the day. So the industry has changed so much. Um, and we've all had to adapt. The algorithms showing whose content gets shown where. I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with all of the changes to that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Gotta watch. Gotta watch what I say. Gotta be careful as to what I tag.
Yeah.
And, let's not forget the trolls. There's plenty of trolls out there on the internet.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And you can't, that's it's difficult because especially, I mean, you know, I'm writing about legitimate social conflicts in some of my work, and so I have to be very careful about how I present that and try to do it in as straightforward a manner, but also say, but it's also fiction. But I want to be real about, this is real. Here's real history. Here's where we're going to have fun with it. And then here's some things that are some social commentary, and because I think you can't you as a writer can't completely remove yourself and your modern era from what you're working on. So I think the parallels become inevitable. But yeah, it's a difficult time because it's like if you avoid conflict entirely, or if you avoid something that can potentially be contentious, then you have no conflict in your story. So like you still have to be there still has to be some stuff there to talk about, and we can't just whitewash or sanitize things down completely. Then there's nothing there. There's no there. Um, but yeah, but getting that message out to people, it's very difficult. There's a lot. The signal to noise ratio in just content creation of any kind is really, really difficult. So that's all this to say, to go back to, sorry for the tangent, but to go back to, it does have to be fun. We have to be having fun with it ourselves because the industries are very difficult to keep that little flame of the spark, that creative joy alive. It's very difficult sometimes.
Yeah. And so for how long too has steampunk been going on?
So I didn't realize I was sort of writing steampunk related material. So when steampunk started to become a thing, the term itself goes back to the late 70s and early 80s when K.W. Jeter is the man who coined steampunk first. And it came out of cyberpunk. So you remember when cyberpunk was like a big deal in like the 80s, where you have sort of let's think about cyberpunk materials, things like Escape from New York and things like Blade Runner are really cyberpunk. And then you see that in the 90s with The Matrix, which is very cyberpunk. So the idea of biotech and things like that it was very popular at the time, which was using interesting ways of almost antiquated technologies and or emergent technologies into biological things. So cyberpunk was a big science fiction subgenre.
Yeah.
And so KW Jeter was saying, okay, I'm doing that, but I'm doing it with steam powered things. So is it steampunk? And then that stuck.
Interesting. Okay, so he was the man that coined it
Yeah,
all.
yeah, KW Jeter, and his if you're curious about his work is wonderful. He's also a very, very nice man. His Infernal Devices series are the ones that kind of kicked off steampunk as a term. And then others who were writing science fiction at the time started dabbling in those kinds of things too. And another very critical important text in terms of early steampunk is William Gibson's The Difference Engine. So that's very, very important. So the writers working in this time period were playing with some of the same things and some of the same questions about emergent technologies, but we're doing it with the concept of steampunk being, okay, well, what if there's almost a retrofitting of technology, our modern computing, but what if it was being done in a steam powered environment? And I think so. The groundwork was being laid for decades before steampunk as an emergent subculture and event based community was really starting to crop up by the early 2000s. when it started to be adopted into fashion. And part of that is a certain push towards DIY. So the idea of do it yourself uh, and crafting, the interest in a pushback against cheaply made things and the interest in personal creation of beautiful things. So going back to what I was talking about earlier about the McMansion versus the actual mansion that had these elaborate that invested in artisans' work inside the house. There's a push towards that. That's a confluence of both the literature that had been being written for decades, and then a certain part of the society and social culture being like, hey, what if we went back to having beautiful things and we made beautiful things? What if we could do it ourselves? And an interest in sort of the lost arts of things like watchmaking and things like glass blowing and other, other artisan based things, wood carvings. And so places, steampunk grew out of wanting to share the love of these trades, the love of these arts, and the love of the literature that had already been in the water. And then, okay, now let's all get together and let's show off our costumes, because costuming is also the critical part of steampunk. Because people, just to go back to what you said, there's a romanticization of that time period of dressing lavishly. So a lot of our modern clothes being boring, people want to push back against that, especially for men. Like men don't get exciting clothes in a modern sense. Whereas in steampunk, you can have a three-piece suit and it can be beautiful brocade fabric and it can be flashy and fun, and you get accessories, you can have hats. And so it's fun for everybody, and also just for, for non-binary folks too. It's like there's different ways you can kind of like um kind of gender bend clothing in the 19th century, because you have so many layers. So there's so many cool things you can do with it. And it's also, you can be very deconstruction with it. The important part about steampunk is the punk part. So you've got goths who are starting to lose their goth clubs by the early 2000s. I mean, it's like RIP all my old goth clubs from the 90s. I'm an old school goth, and I'm still goth. It's not a phase. They say in steampunk there's this thing of like, oh, steampunk is when goths discovered brown. I'm no, 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 no. There's plenty of us that did not feel like we had to change our color palette at all. We're still wearing corsets. It's just we're just doing all in black. And we decided to take our Vampire the Masquerade LARP game and create a convention out of it. So there's a lot of that that's in the undercurrent too, of like gaming groups that are wanting to kind of have much more of a community about it. So steampunk starts to become this life event thing, and you start to have communities online and then in person, meetup groups becoming conventions, because you have like-minded people who are interested in fashion, in crafting, in learning new things, in history, their curiosity about history, and wanting to kind of come together and celebrate that. Music's also a part of it, and the music style in steampunk is really eclectic, all kinds of different styles. So eclecticism really is, I guess, it's hard to define steampunk as a genre of music. It's kind of sort of, if you have a historic sound and then you do something different with it, it's again, you have to punk it. It has to be something where you're doing a certain amount of deconstruction to do it yourself, and seize the means of production, as it were, to
Yeah, it's
create.
like this revisitation that the very early rock bands had with the very early blues musicians that they grew up
Yeah,
listening to.
yeah, that's a great parallel. Absolutely. So this is all. So that there's your little history of steampunk in there. And so I was writing historical fantasy, and then I had somebody in the early 2000s tell me, "Oh, you should go to this." It was at the time called TempleCon. And sadly, that a convention no longer exists in Rhode Island, but it was a great steampunk convention for a long time, that was focusing on retrofuturism, which I thought was a great term. That was sort of their catchphrase. It was retrofuturism. The idea of like, what if we reimagine a future, but we do it with some gears and steam power and other technologies from the before times, as it were.
Sounds very interesting. Sounds like what a lot of people, whether they're conscious or public about it or not, are very interested in.
Yeah, it's really, and I'm so glad that it's still going strong. I mean, the steampunk conventions were starting to come onto the scene in the early 2000s, and I'm still a part of a lot of them. Some of them have changed through the years, and some of them have moved from one part of the country to another. But I have longstanding relationships with a lot of the different steampunk conventions, especially on the East Coast. It's harder for me to get all the way across to California, so I'm New York based. But there's a great resource called the Steampunk Explorer. So I'll give a big shout out to Steve at the Steampunk Explorer, as well as the Airship Ambassador. Those are two accounts that try to track a lot of steampunk events. And so the Steampunk Explorer just launched a new part of his website where he has author pages for different authors who are in the steampunk genre, and also their convention appearances. So I'll be a guest of honor uh, at the Wild Wild West convention in Tucson, Arizona this year. I'll be a part of the Bourbon City Steampunk Convention down in Louisville, which is a great new convention. It's the second year and it's delightful. And then I'll be part of this Chicago Steampunk Exposition later in this year, and so I'll try to get back to Vermont because the Vermont Steampunk Expo is always great, and they have the Vermont Science Fiction Fantasy Expo is also fantastic. So the Vermont Gatherings group puts on a great show, as you know, because that's where we met.
Yes, exactly. I love going to Vermont. People are absolutely lovely, and VT Gatherings does a
Yep.
fantastic job. I do
Yeah,
recommend always going to their events.
and I'll be back at the Brickstore Museum for their steampunk festival in September. So I won't have the new book out yet that mentions the Brickstore Museum there or mentions the local lore there. That doesn't come out until September 30th. But I might be able to have a few advanced copies there at that event. So that'll be, I think it's the 21st of September. I have to double check my calendar, but it's cool that I'm able to kind of like have a few things that are my regular haunts in steampunk, and it's been the most consistent for me as a writer. My most consistent convention experience has been continuing to be a part of the steampunk just community, because the elements that bring us all together. I love coming and seeing what new costumes people have put together from one year to the next. I love to see what new character they've created for themselves. So, the storytelling that goes along with steampunk as a culture, as a group, is so exciting. And there's always just something new. There's always something new to see and look at and to share with other creatives. It really brings together all kinds of different types of creatives, which is why I think the steampunk is still why there's still events at all, why it wasn't just a passing phase. It's still something that continues to kind of be able to reinvent itself because it is so creation based.
I think so. And I think as long as there is room for people to be creative, it's going to continue to be around. Now, is there anything you would like to share or feel like needs a spotlight before we start to call it?
I think just if you're curious about my work, I'm always doing new work. I always have new books coming out. So just I'm at leannarenehieber.com, and I'm on most social medias, although I'm trying to be on them less because I am on some pretty crazy deadlines. If you're interested in haunted history, I will definitely hold up and highlight my book on women ghosts. So this is called A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts, and it's co-authored with my Burrows of the Dead boss. Burrows of the Dead is New York's top ghost tour company, and so Andrea Janes founded the company, and I started working as a ghost tour guide there. And I was giving a tour, and an editor from a publishing house who was familiar with my fiction said, I love your passion for this material, so maybe you should think about some nonfiction. So talked with Andrea about it, and like, hey, maybe we can turn our mutual love of ghost storytelling into something where we examine some of women's ghost stories and how they've been have they changed through the years for some of our favorite women ghosts, looking at their narratives and like were some of these ghost stories ways in which the women's story transcended what happened to them in life, or was it something where they kind of lost control of the narrative of what actually happened in life? So it's real history. It's strange and weird accounts of the various haunted locations where these women's ghosts are featured, and or we debunk some myths about You know, it would be fascinating if there was a witch's curse of Bucksport, Maine, but it's all made up. So, so you know,
As are a lot of ghost stories in Maine.
yeah. So we really, and we want to be much like, and this goes back to what we were talking about with spiritualism before too. It's like that there, I love that there are all of these great ghost stories out there, but you just like with spiritualism, you have to be very well aware that a lot of these things were completely made up. And a lot of things were made up just to either to sell tickets to a haunted attraction or because people love making up urban legends, you know. So there has to be a certain amount of like understanding that we're going into all of these things, especially with ghost lore, where you can't completely prove it. There's maybe there will be a science that proves it all at some point, but we're not there yet. I don't think those things are incompatible. We're just not quite there. Um, and I love asking those questions about history, about how can we be ghosts kind of let us experience history now, because if it's a current haunting, then you have some echo from the past that is still present in your modern moment. And what does that say about us as to how we talk about those entities? That's pretty interesting. I think that you can look, and a lot of things you can read into a lot about culture, from what their urban legends are, or what their mythology is, or what their folklore is. And I just find that endlessly fascinating. And there's always a new ghost story to be told, in a lot of ways. So it's difficult because it's hard to sometimes really source these things, and you have to figure out how do we separate the fact from the fiction. And so that's the main difficulty in a lot of my nonfiction work. In my fiction work, I just love telling a good story. So, and I appreciate that you love the same.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Leanna, for coming on.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thanks for your time and for talking about the genre.